fact, we had a hearing last year on drugged driving, which has been on the rise in recent years, but we haven't really addressed the number one cause of death on America's roads, drunk driving. More than 10,000 deaths. About 30% of all fatal crashes are caused by drunk driving each year. That translates into almost 30 people dying in drunk driving crashes every day, or one person every 4 minutes in 2017. That's when the data is from. And that's not counting the number of people who are seriously injured in drunk driving crashes. The National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, conducted a study in 2016 that found that, quote, alcohol was the largest contributor to crashes, unquote. We all know drunk driving is a problem, but whether it's because they are too intoxicated to make reasonable judgments or they inaccurately
agreed to take me to Disneyland with my 3 sisters, but to save money, they decided to take some Korean food, kimbap, which is rice with Korean vegetables wrapped up in seaweed. So this was 35 years ago. That kind of food was quite exotic. So when we were there and we opened up thinking kind of faux Asian stuff, if we wanted to come.
These are devices that can detect levels of alcohol in a person's system, and if above the legal limit, will prevent a car from starting. Generally, this involves breathing into a tube and waiting for an analysis to be completed, which may take a little time. This too has been effective in preventing individuals convicted of drunk driving from doing so again, as long as the device is in his or her car. All states have some form of ignition interlock laws, some making it an option condition after.
I want to thank you all for coming, and I especially want to thank the ranking members behind me that are here today to discuss the letter that we are sending to Speaker Pelosi requesting that H.R.S. 109, the Green New Deal, actually has hearing in there. This is the start of a conversation that I believe is long overdue. One that Congress and its committees should have a meeting. Congressional committees are where ideas like the Green New Deal should be debated. Only through the scrutiny of the legislative process can the American people get a true sense of how these proposals and sound bites translate into actual change.
So I look forward to
we know so far that the Green New Deal
whether expand the use of interlock devices
from our travel to home ownership to what agriculture we could actually even do. And this is just the start. This national mobilization includes government takeover of healthcare, free college, and an international exchange of technology that would stifle innovation and sort of
to develop more integrated technologies known as driver alcohol detention systems for safety, or DAS, that can be deployed even more expansively. I know my friend and colleague Debbie Dingell will be recognized, but it should be noted that several of her constituents recently died in a tragic accident because of drunk driving. Debbie has introduced legislation aimed at curbing drunk driving, and so I thank her for her efforts to make our roads safer, and I stand with you as an ally in your fight. NHTSA can and should be pressing automakers to develop and deploy this technology faster, these different technologies faster, and let's stop wasting time and start to take meaningful steps to turn back the tide on these tragedies. So I want to thank all our witnesses for coming today, and I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Kathy McMorris-Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee hearing on enhancing vehicle technology to prevent drunk driving. Drive sober or get pulled over is a phrase we all remember hearing in the classroom or on television, and it remains just as important a message today as it ever has. Drunk driving is a significant public health concern that tragically cuts life short for so many. Not just those who make the reckless decision to get behind the wheel after consuming alcohol, but our family and friends on the road in the wrong place at the wrong time. Although alcohol-impaired driving has decreased by about 30% over the last 3 decades, it remains a serious and fatal risk on our roadways, claiming almost 11,000 lives each year. The status quo is not acceptable. We can and we must do better. Drug-impaired driving is also on the rise. Drug use and abuse have increasingly become central social issues. On opioids, last Congress, we passed a comprehensive bipartisan package to help combat the epidemic, expand access to treatment, and protect our communities. But opioids aren't the only drug making our roads less safe. So is marijuana. In fact, marijuana is the most common drug found in fatally injured drivers. It increases drowsiness and decreases reaction speed, both of which severely limit a driver's ability to operate a vehicle safely. In 2012, my home state of Washington legalized marijuana, and Washingtonians have seen decreases in roadway safety since then. In 2017, the Northwest High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area conducted a report of the effects of marijuana. The report produced some pretty disturbing results. 1 in 5 10th graders, 1 in 4 12th graders reported riding with a driver who's been using marijuana. 1 in 6 12th graders admitted to driving a vehicle within 3 hours of consuming marijuana. The percentage of marijuana-positive drivers more than doubled from 7.8% to 18.9%. And fatal crashes involving marijuana have spiked to almost 13% from 7.8% prior to legalization. The increase in recreational use of marijuana poses a serious threat to roadway safety. We must learn from the lessons we've seen in my home state and make sure we're focusing on addressing drug-impaired driving and alcohol-impaired driving. On this committee, it's our job to explore how technology and innovation can improve people's lives, even save their lives. For example, ride-sharing technology platforms have given people better and more options to get home safely. By providing an easy and user-friendly option, more people are opting for ride-sharing rather than getting behind the wheel after drinking or taking drugs. The subcommittee has been working on these issues for years, highlighting the sharing economy at a Disruptor series in 2015. We should not lose sight of the fact that we lose almost 40,000 Americans on our roads every year. 94% of car crashes are caused by human error. Whether it be driving while tired, distracted, or after drinking or taking drugs, human error causes crashes. Self-driving cars offer a technology-based solution that will save lives if the government regulations are updated from their 1970s approach over brake pedals and steering wheels. I joined Republican leader Walden and Representative Latta on a letter to Chairman Plone yesterday asking that we continue our work in a bipartisan manner again this Congress. I commend Chair Schakowsky for her leadership on this important issue and look forward to working with you. I want to thank our distinguished panel for your willingness to engage in this discussion today, and I would further welcome discussions with leaders who offer other technology-based solutions to protect Americans. I yield back.
The woman yields back. So the votes have been called, and it looks like we have 1 to 2 votes. We think about 30 minutes. So in fact, we are going to recess, and I apologize to our witnesses, but we'll be back soon. Thank you.
But Stu landed on his feet. He found his way to a pair of tough Texans, handling press for Senator Phil Gramm and then Senator Cornyn. He became famous as the communications director who could outsmart everybody and outwork everybody in a town where it's very hard to do either. That's where Stu caught my eye. As I prepared in 2016,
that government remains accountable to the public. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting this common sense resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the gentleman in this time this morning. I intend to support this resolution, but in the matter of time and coming through this week, and might as well have 30 minutes, so we'll talk about a resolution. It's a restatement of the law and the regulation, I'm sorry. But I want to provide some background on the special counsel's regulations. Special Counsel Mueller is operating under a different regulatory framework from the independent counsel statute that gave us the Starr report. The Clinton administration's Justice Department, which was led by Attorney General Janet Reno, Deputy Attorney General
the income threshold. That threshold is $157,500 for individual filers and $315,000 for joint returns, meaning that taxpayers above those income thresholds, who only represent 5% of taxpayers claiming the deduction, will reap 66% of the benefits from the deduction. Another report from the Joint Committee on Taxation finds that more than half the benefit of the pass-through deduction will be claimed by taxpayers with income in the top 1%. Are you concerned that a provision that was supposed to benefit small businesses is largely benefiting the wealthy?
Well, let me just comment that in pass-throughs, there is one level of taxation as opposed to two levels of taxation. The idea of the pass-through discount was to create businesses that are pass-throughs to make them competitive with corporations and to eliminate a lot of what would have been the switching costs had people made those as corporations. So,
but our small businesses are not receiving that benefit.
Again, what I would just say, I don't have the specifics, and we'll try to get back to you on this, but the idea was that no different than corporations would pass on significant part of those benefits to workers and investment that
Perdue joins us now. He sits on the Armed Services Committee and the Budget Committee. Senator, good morning to you. Thank you. And Bill's going to join us too out in Hanoi for this conversation. But if you could, in the last we checked, $22 trillion our national debt has reached. What is the message at CPAC? What are we going to do about it?
Well, I think this president has called this out before, but as you said just 2 weeks ago, our national debt ticked over to $22 trillion. And more draconian than that, Sandra, is that Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about a crisis in my home state, and indeed 5 other states across the Southeast, to talk about
just awaiting Mr. Latta, who's going to give an opening statement for the minority. And so it should just be a second, otherwise I'll get going anyway. I'll call the subcommittee back to order and yield for an opening statement. In the absence of the chairman of the full committee, I'm happy to yield to Congresswoman Dingell.
Thank you, Chairman Chakowski. And I want to really give you a sincere and heartfelt thank you for holding this important hearing today. As both of you spoke about before votes, drunk driving brings pain to families and communities across this country. Our community in Dearborn and in Michigan felt it only 6 weeks, 8 weeks ago. In January, the Abbas family, Sam, Rima, Ali, Isabel, and Giselle, were driving back from a family vacation in Florida when their car was struck head-on by a drunk driver. No one survived. And everybody in our community felt it. It was that they were active, integral members of our community. But what's sad is that this story has been repeated for years, over and over again. And Congress needs to step up and do something about it. Their deaths, and the thousands just like them each year, are avoidable and preventable. The technology exists to save lives. A little girl at the funeral came up to me, she was a classmate, and said, "There's technology. Why are you not using it? Why won't Congress act? My friend should be here today." That statement is in my heart. So my question to each member, witness, and all the public watching today is simple. Why aren't we using it? We need to explore every possible solution, including giving law enforcement the resources that they need to get drunk driving off the roads. Institute mandatory first offender interlock laws across the country, and get the DAD-SS DADS technology in cars as fast as we can. Nothing's going to bring back the Abbas family or the thousands. There are more stories in the last week. I mean, we should stop hearing these stories. Their lives are too important to forget. We need to make sure that the family that I know from my community, the Abbas family's death, is not in vain. But we need to make all of these deaths an example of why we must act now. We must address this challenge. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. I now recognize Mr. Latta for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for holding this very important hearing today, and I thank our witnesses for being with us today. We have the opportunity to discuss how we can utilize different technologies to address and prevent drunk and drug driving. Over 10,000 people lost their lives in 2017 in alcohol and impaired driving crashes. We've also seen a significant increase in the number of American drivers killed in vehicle crashes in which drugs were detected. 94% of overall vehicle accidents are attributable to human errors or decisions, and we have seen a significant increase in the number of Americans killed in vehicle crashes in which drugs were detected. The statistics are staggering and show that it is imperative the public and private sectors work together on a solution to prevent more tragedies. Amid the devastating opioid crisis, and as more states legalize the use of marijuana, tackling this problem is now more important than ever. According to the Governor's Highway Safety Association in 2016, the number of drivers who were fatally injured in accidents with drugs in their system surpassed the number of those with alcohol in their system for the very first time. That is why in last Congress I recognized the importance of promoting and fostering innovation in self-driving vehicle technology. As chair of the subcommittee in last Congress, I introduced the bipartisan Self-Drive Act, which would have clarified the federal and state rule roles in regulating self-driving vehicles, ensure consumer safety, reduce traffic-related fatalities and injuries, and improve mobility for individuals with disabilities. U.S. companies are investing major resources in the research and development of this technology, and the Self-Driving Act would have removed outdated regulations that were created when self-driving vehicles were considered science fiction. Since this legislation passed unanimously both in committee and on the floor, it is my hope that we can make this a priority again in this Congress. We have an opportunity through technology to make investments needed in self-driving technology as one step to ending senseless deaths on our roads. Until that day comes, we all need to do all we can to raise awareness of the dangers of impaired driving. And again, I want to thank all the members on this committee and all of our staff on both sides for all of the hard work that they did. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. So I would now like to introduce our witnesses for... The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. And now I'd like to introduce the witnesses. Ms. Helen Whitty is the national president of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Dr. Robert Strasburger oversees the DADS program that I'm really anxious to hear more about. And the Honorable Joan Claybrook, board member of Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety and former administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and it's welcome. And Dr. David Kelly, executive director of the Coalition of Ignition Interlocks Manufacturers. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today, and we look forward to your testimony. And at this time, the chair will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes. I think everybody here has testified. You know, you have 5 minutes, and there is a light that will go off when you have 1 minute left. So I hope that you'll consider wrapping it up. So I'm going to first begin. Did I say questions? No. I want to begin, Ms. Whitty. You are recognized now for 5 minutes. Put your microphone on. Got it?
Talk.
There you go.
Thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and other distinguished members of the committee for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify. I'm here today on behalf of Mothers Against Drunk Driving and representing the millions of victims of drunk driving crashes. I would also like to thank Representative Debbie Dingell for her leadership and action following the tragic death of a family from Dearborn, the Abbas family, Issam, Rima, Ali, Isabella, and Giselle, were killed by a wrong-way driver, a drunk driver. Like the Abbas family, I have a story. I'm here because my 16-year-old daughter is not. One day on a bright sunny June afternoon, she went rollerblading on a well-known route and didn't come home. Until that day, my husband and I had the dream family, the one we'd always dreamed of, 2 children, a girl and a boy. They were named for us, so we had the perfect names, John and Helen Marie. It was Helen Marie because I didn't want to be Big Helen or Old Helen. And she was my firstborn, so she put me through my mom paces, and she was so excited when she learned that her brother John was due to arrive. But yet when she learned that he was there to stay, and she had to learn to share, she had to get used to that, and she did. But the most important thing was she learned to love him deeply. They were not perfect children, perfect names maybe, but not perfect children. They were well-adjusted, and that's what we prayed for. An alcohol and marijuana-impaired teen driver ended our dream. Helen Marie was rollerblading on a bike path when she looked up and saw a car on that bike path spinning toward her. There was nothing she could do but die. Very suddenly and very violently. I can't tell you what the days
and months and years were like after that. It was preparing for my daughter's 16-year-old daughter's funeral. It was receiving a call asking for body parts. It was packing up her things that still held her essence. It was standing in a criminal courtroom. But I can tell you that MAD was there. They were there to show me I would not die of the grief. They were there to give me hope, and they also gave me a platform on which I could learn and then fight from. First, I could only lean on it. Toward a day when there's no more victims of this awful crime, and the technology's there, that's the frustrating part. HM's life ended, but mine did not. And that's why I'm here. MAD's campaign to eliminate drunk driving is our top priority, and the testimony I submitted contains detailed information about two campaign components, law enforcement and ignition interlocks. Today, I'd like to specifically talk about advanced vehicle technologies, which could one day prevent a drunk driver from operating a vehicle. The idea for such technology was born in 2006 at a MAD Technology Symposium in New Mexico. The concept was to integrate into the vehicle a passive alcohol sensor to unobtrusively detect a driver's BAC. The concept became a reality over a decade ago and is known as DADS. MAD worked diligently to get this program started and to get the government funding to advance this program. I represent drunk driving victims who want this killing to end now. Our goal is to get this technology into vehicles for consumers to purchase as soon as possible. Therefore, I issue a challenge to the auto industry, including OEMs, suppliers, and the government, to make DADS commercially available and for NHTSA to begin a rulemaking on DADS as soon as possible. To aid in transferring DADS to the auto industry for commercialization, a large fleet test would help expedite the technology. In 1982, the General Services Administration ordered 5,000 cars with driver's side airbags. This stimulated the market and resulted in widespread acceptance and use. MAD calls for a similar model. We understand that DADS development is challenging, but the industry has the resources and the expertise to make safety advancements a reality. Auto detection technology needs to be a top priority. With this committee's continued leadership, we could soon witness historic results with 7,000 lives saved every year. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman Schakowsky and Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers for allowing me the opportunity to testify on this important issue. And I look forward to working with all of you and answering any questions you have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Strasburger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to update you on the DADS research program. Despite significant efforts over the years, drunk driving in the U.S. remains our most intractable safety problem. To help address this, automakers and NHTSA formed the DADS partnership to research the widespread use of non-invasive technology to prevent drunk driving. Public-private partnerships like DADS have led innovations that have enhanced our everyday lives, such as the internet, GPS, the microchip, and Wi-Fi. The DADS program is working to invent technology that can detect when a driver is impaired by alcohol and prevent the car from moving. Once the technology has met rigorous performance standards, it will be offered voluntarily as a safety option, similar to other driver assist systems like automatic emergency braking or lane departure warning. DADS technologies hold the greatest promise and are likely the fastest pathway for reversing the drunk driving trends in the United States. Two technologies are being researched, a touch-based system and a breath-based system. The breath-based system measures alcohol as a driver breathes normally when seated in the driver's seat. The touch-based system measures blood alcohol by shining an infrared light through the fingertip of the driver when he or she touches the vehicle control, like the starter button. A significant part of our research is focused on achieving the performance specifications for speed, accuracy, precision, and reliability of the alcohol measurement. These stringent specifications are necessary to ensure that no driver at or above a weight is allowed to drive, while also ensuring that sober drivers are not hassled by the technology. We are not modifying existing or off-the-shelf technologies, but inventing new technology that must reliably operate over the 20-year life of a vehicle in the harshest environment, the interior of the car. One measure of our progress is DAD's patent portfolio, which currently includes 10 patent families worldwide, covering 10 patent areas. The number of applications exceed 50, and 9 patents have issued. On-road testing of the DAD's prototype sensors is underway. This is one of those sensors. This testing complements more controlled testing in the laboratory and human subject testing in a hospital setting. We are pleased and honored to have the Virginia Highway Safety Office and James River Transportation participate in the on-road evaluations. Virginia is also helping in other ways to ready the public for the deployment of DAD's technologies and to reduce drunk driving generally that I describe in my written testimony. Virginia is a model for other states to follow. While the DADS program is currently still in the invention phase, we estimate that in 2020, we will release the breath-based DADS technology for fleet vehicles and accessory applications. And in 2024, we are targeting the release of both the breath-based and touch-based DADS technologies for consumer vehicles, depending on resource availability in 2020 and beyond. While continued research is needed to achieve our 2020 and our 2020
question, and I think and again, I think each of the panelists will have their own perspectives, but I'll give you just some relevant ones, which is, in terms of our ability to prepare for a pandemic, we're far, more prepared than we were 10 years ago, thanks to Congress, and again, the appropriations that Congress gave back in 2005 and 2006 of about $7 billion to really focus our efforts about pandemic influenza, which is the
coalition of consumer health safety groups and insurers who are working together to save lives by promoting adoption of safety laws. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. The topic of the hearing, enhancing vehicle technology to prevent drunk driving, is an issue I feel passionately about and to which I have devoted many efforts over many years.
Of the Air Force. 685,000 airmen, down from 900. Doesn't always
said, if we go to war next
military last year. 5 key.
So that's a
Your expectation goes to the nuclear triad. It's incredibly important.
As you know,
In the air and then stay longest in the air. And so when we look at the strategy,
readiness gaps that you would like to see addressed.
ma'am, I would just start with analyze why to fly and why
any addition
that was put into the
schools.
In 2012,
I could
estimated that since 1960, over 600,000 lives, and that's old data now, have been saved by motor vehicle safety technologies, most of them in federal standards. One of our most recent achievements was the federal requirement for rear-view cameras as standard equipment in all new cars as of May of this last year. This landmark law never would have been enacted without the remarkable leadership of Chairwoman Schakowsky and the tireless devotion of the victim families. So thank you so much, Madam Chairman. Similarly, we push forward to reduce drinking and driving with proven technologies, including ignition interlock devices known as IIDs and sensor technology. Advocates commends Representative Debbie Dingell, thank you so much, for your recent introduction of legislation to reduce drunk driving following the horrific crash that you mentioned in Northville, Michigan. State laws requiring all convicted drunk drivers to have an IID installed in their vehicle have been shown to be incredibly effective. As such, Congress and NHTSA should continue to motivate the states to enact this life-saving law and to consider the addition of sanctions for states that fail to act. Federal legislation enacted with the warning of financial sanctions encourage every state to adopt the age 21 minimum drinking age, a zero tolerance BAC law for underage drinking and driving, a 0.08% law, BAC law. Every one of these life-saving federal laws resulted in every state taking action, and not a single state lost $1 of federal construction money, highway construction money as a result, although that was the penalty if they did not, because they acted. Additionally, the further development of sensor technology holds great promise to reduce drunk driving crashes. Considerable research has gone into the developing the driver alcohol detection system for safety known as DADS. After more than a decade of research and millions of dollars provided by Congress, NHTSA and the industry should be doing everything they can to get these technology into vehicles without further delay. But unfortunately, they aren't. And I think the instrumental word that Mr. Strasburger mentioned was that they didn't want to have this in vehicles so that people would be hassled by the technology. Well, people aren't hassled by this technology because it doesn't come into play unless you're drinking and driving. So that's a ridiculous statement. I call Mr. Strasburger the industry excuse man. I've testified against him on many, many occasions, and I hope that he will get over this one day. All right. So, placing DADS into these vehicles is essential, and there is no better way to advance a potential life-saving technology. I just talked to Mr. Kelly, and it's my estimate, based on what he said, I want to emphasize that if we put these in every single vehicle, it'll be about $10 a vehicle. Who wouldn't pay $10 to put this system into their vehicles so that people would not drive drunk? While IIDs and sensor systems prevent drunk driving, one of the most important defenses, of course, for the drunk driver is a safe car as well. Current advanced driver assistance systems, such as automatic emergency braking, lane departure warning, and blind spot detection, have verified safety benefits. Yet none of these systems, none of them, are required to be standard equipment in all vehicles, and all of them are in some vehicles, so we know that they work. Excuse me. In fact, many of these technologies are offered only on the most expensive models as a part of a costly luxury package. We urge Congress to require these proven technologies to be standard equipment in all new vehicles by issuing new federal motor vehicle safety standards with a deadline for implementation, just like the rear camera. In addition to achieving these benefits now, these advanced technologies can serve as building blocks on the path to autonomous vehicles, which we've already heard Ms. Lada mention this today. I appeared recently on a panel with industry individuals who said that they are a long way down the road, so they're not going to be the substitute for these technology systems on alcohol. Please wrap it up, okay? Okay, sorry. Thank you. And I would like to commend the law enforcement officers who daily risk their lives in order to prevent drunk driving. Their lives, too, would be better off if we had these systems in cars. So by deploying all of these known sensible solutions, we can once again make significant progress to reduce drunk driving, and I hope that the committee will not fail to act on these. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back, and now Mr. Kelly, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Morris Rogers, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss an issue that I have dedicated most of my professional career towards, reducing drunk driving. My name is David Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Ignition Interlock Manufacturers. I do want to thank Representative Dingell for the leadership that you've shown with your bill. I can tell you from firsthand experience that the family really appreciates what you've done and the support that you've given them. So I thank you for that. The coalition is composed of the nation's leading companies that manufacture ignition interlock devices. These devices prohibit alcohol-impaired drivers from starting their vehicle. We combine our members' expertise, innovation, and experience to speak with one voice to reduce alcohol-related vehicle fatalities. Ignition interlocks do what no other technology available today does. They stop drunk drivers from starting their vehicle. An ignition interlock device is a breathalyzer, just like this, that is installed in a drunk driving offender's vehicle to prevent drinking and driving. Interlocks must meet specific standards that are set by NHTSA. All of the breath test data is stored in the device and is sent to the monitoring agency that is subscribed by that state. Interlocks are a cost-effective and innovative solution designed to keep our public roadways safe. At a cost of less than $3 per day, paid for by the offender, Interlocks provide a safety blanket for the cost of a cup of coffee while freeing up law enforcement to pursue other crimes. The supporter of ignition interlocks are a who's who in traffic safety. MAD, AAA, advocates, the Alliance for Automobile Manufacturers, the American Trauma Society, CDC, Governor's Highway Safety Association, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, National Safety Council, Responsibility.org, just to name a few. All of these organizations actively support ignition interlock devices and first offender laws. Many convicted drunk drivers, however, continue to drive on a suspended license because they must in order to keep their jobs, take care of their families, or continue with school. Interlocks provide an opportunity for offenders to continue driving legally and safely to successfully get on with their lives. Coalition works with policymakers across the country to provide the latest, credible, factual information on ignition interlock devices. Our members are at the forefront of effective ignition interlock programs in every state to deploy this life-saving technology. According to MAD, over the last decade, Interlocks has stopped 2.7 million attempts to drive drunk. 2.7 million over the last decade. Our challenge is to get all 50 states to adopt first offender ignition interlock laws. Currently, 32 states have first offender laws on the books, and we're working with the remaining 18 states to pass first offender ignition interlock laws. However, we also advocate for other improvements to state laws. This would include an immediate reinstatement measure where you can get your driving privileges the day after you get arrested, or compliance-based removal, where you do not have the device removed from your vehicle until you can demonstrate a changed behavior and a 30-day, 60-day, depending on state law, change in behavior where you have an alcohol-free experience with the device. Our devices, some of our devices have cameras, have GPS. We have lots of advanced technology in the devices, so this is a lot of technology in a very small handset. Currently, states that pass first offender ignition interlock laws should be awarded an incentive grant from NHTSA. That was authorized in the last highway bill. However, the NHTSA rules for awarding these grants are needlessly complicated and inflexible. As a result, only 7 of the 32 states with first offender laws have even qualified for the grant money. We're hoping to streamline that process in the next authorization. One of the other things that we need to think about in the next authorization is law enforcement, providing them more funds, as has been talked about, and also looking at how we're going to get more arrests. We know drunk driving arrests are down over the past decade. We need to reverse this trend. There are other technologies being developed and supported by many in the safety community. While these technologies hold promise, it is important to note that the only commercially available technology that exists today to prevent an impaired driver from starting their vehicle is the ignition interlock. Technology will continue to evolve, including in the interlock industry. As a safety community, we must be prepared to adapt to emerging technologies. However, until they are ready to be deployed, we can't forget what is proven and will likely be the only technology available to prevent drunk driving for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll begin 5 minutes of member statements, member questions, and I will recognize myself to begin. I wanted to thank you, Ms. Whitty, for the dedication that you've had over the years now, and your compelling story about your daughter. Moms, everybody knows moms, and I'm just wondering, the number one priority, obviously, is to stop drunk drivers. Is your number one priority in that category that solutions like DAD is necessary?
Yes. DADs needs to be commercialized and deployed in a large fleet so that more people hear about it. Safety just is not an option. We need to stop the killing. Here she is. Here's my rock star. And what a beautiful way to use technology. Like Representative Dingell said, why don't we use the technology? And so yes.
Thank you. So, Mr. Strasburger, the technology being developed with the DADS program shows some real potential for saving lives. Progress seems to have stalled, and I'd like to hear more from you about the progress of the program.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Progress is anything but stalled. We have made significant progress with the breath-based technology, as I mentioned in my statement and in my testimony. We are targeting releasing the breath-based technology in 2020 for fleet applications. I support and agree, and I think it's constructive suggestion that this technology be deployed in GSA vehicles, and would look forward to having a discussion about how we can make that happen, how that should be structured as quickly as possible. I agree that would help further deployment.
Can I just ask you a question? Can someone disconnect, not deploy the driver I'm talking about? Is this something that can be overridden by the individual in the car?
The design of DADS is intended not to be overridden by the driver. In fact, our performance specifications are such that we would make that very difficult. However, we're looking at different operating scenarios where, under extreme circumstances, it might need to be overridden. And then if it is, what follow-up action should be taken by the driver. For example, performance of the vehicle is degraded until they see a dealer to have the system restored, what have you.
Let me talk to Ms. Claybrook, who has certainly been the lifelong advocate on auto safety. Do you have any concerns about the DADS program or the compliance of or willingness of the industry to help move that forward?
I don't know what's the matter with
Here,
I don't know what's the matter with the industry on this issue. This issue came up when I was administrator in the 1970s. John DeLorean supported it in the 1970s and 80s on his experimental car. And he was a former General Motors executive. And now we're talking about this has been an active partnership since 2006. 2006? That's 13 years ago. Where is this system? It didn't take that long to produce airbags. Airbags are a lot more complicated than this. A lot more complicated. And they cost a lot more. So why isn't this system in every car? I do not understand that. I think this committee should pass a law that requires...
And significant one. The question is this.
What's the problem?
Do we want the executive branch now or in the future to hold the power of the purse, a power that the framers deliberately entrusted to Congress? We must stand up and defend Congress's institutional powers as the framers intended that we would, even when doing so is inconvenient or goes against the outcome that we might prefer. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution of disapproval and our Constitution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Vermont.
Mr. President,
what if you don't do that?
This is a debate worth happening. I appreciate the comments from my neighbor.
I yield back, and now I yield to our ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
It is an important matter for us to consider. When President Trump declared a national emergency, he cited a crisis at the southern border. But it's become more and more evident he did it for only one reason: to do an end run around Congress and the Appropriations Committee, and use taxpayer money to build a wall on the southern border that Congress has refused to fund. For 3 years, he failed to convince a Congress, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Republican-controlled House, that his wall was a good idea. For 3 years, he requested that Congress fund his cynical campaign promise to build, quote, big, beautiful, close quote, wall on the southern border. And for 3 years, the Republican-controlled Congress refused. And so, even when his own party controlled both chambers of Congress, he couldn't convince enough members that it was a good idea. And certainly nobody accepted his pledge that Mexico would pay for the wall. We all knew the U.S. taxpayers would have to pay for it. So instead of accepting that we live in a democracy and he's not a monarch, instead of accepting that in a democracy there are two other co-equal branches of government that can constrain his actions, the president has decided to ignore the Constitution and the will of Congress and go it alone. Now, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, as we all know, established that Congress, actually Congress alone, has the power of the purse. Congress' exclusive power over our government spending priorities is one of the most critical checks and balances in our constitutional system. Anybody goes back and reads the history of the founding of this country and hear the debate and hear what George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, everybody else said, we know that from the founding of this country, and the reason we're the oldest existing democracy currently in the world is that we believed in the checks and balances. The president, of course, can propose funding for whatever projects he wants, but it's the job of Congress to decide where to invest the American people's hard-earned tax dollars. And in a democracy, as every president from George Washington to now is supposed to respect those decisions. But after not getting what he wanted, this president has invoked the National Emergencies Act. He's stretching the powers given to him in that act beyond all recognition. He's declared a national emergency on the southern border. But he's not responding to a national emergency. There's no crisis on our southern border requiring such extreme action. What kind of a national emergency is declared only after you lose a 3-year funding fight with members of your own party? What kind of national emergency is resolved in this national emergency by a vaguely defined multi-year construction project? Truth is clear, he's trying to use this authority for a political end. Now, when Congress enacted the National Emergencies Act of 1976, it conveyed certain powers to the president to use in the event of a true emergency that required quick action, and it assumed, and I remember I was here during the debate, and there was a Republican president, that whoever sat in the Oval Office would have enough respect for the office and the power being conveyed not to abuse it. We felt, those of us in the Senate at that time, that whether it's Republican or Democratic president, they would not abuse the power. Well, President Trump has failed that test. Presidential emergency power should only be invoked in a true time of crisis. It's an abuse of power to invoke these authorities just because he couldn't do what he wanted any other way. But let's see what he would do if he has these powers. Now he wants to raise money meant for military housing.
As Floridian, this hearing is
Military base improvements paid for his wall. This almost in the same week we see in the news. So much of military housing is infested by mold, by rats, by asbestos, by all these other problems. He's going to take the money that would make this housing safe for the men and women in our military to pay for his wall. Or is he going to take money from Camp Lejeune that was hit by Hurricane Florence? Badly. I know Camp Lejeune. My son, when he's in the Marines, spent time there. Or is he going to take it from Tyndall Air Force Base, which was flattened by Hurricane Michael? What about money for schools for military families, like the school at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, or a child development center at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland? Or essential training facilities that would ensure military readiness, like a special operations training facility at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which I have visited. You know, Congress chose to fund these projects over an ineffectual, wasteful wall. Congress had to say, where's the money go? We felt these things to help our military be in better shape made far more sense than the wall. Congress used its constitutional power, let me emphasize that, its constitutional power of the purse to set priorities, how we're going to invest the American people's hard-earned tax dollars. Now, the president's trying to label opponents of his action as weak on border security or weak on crime. That's nonsense. I don't know any member of the Senate of either party who doesn't believe in border security or is in favor of crime. But let's see what he asked for. Instead of border security, he wanted $5.7 billion for the wall. It said Congress approved a border security package, money for fencing along with technology at between the ports of entry and additional personnel. That's real border security, not a political stunt. Now the president is saying, well, thank you for your views. Thank you for following your constitutional power, but I'm still going to do it my way. Now, where's it going to stop? And the fact that it is a political game has shown that when this Congress passed overwhelmingly $1.6 billion for border security, the president vetoed that. And then after closing the government for 35 days, costing the taxpayers billions and billions and billions of dollars for nothing, he signed a bill that did not give him the $1.6 billion they vetoed, but gave him $1.3 billion, and that he signed. If anybody thinks this is just games playing, that states it. Over the past 2 years, we've seen the erosion of our institutional checks and balances in the face of creeping authoritarianism. The time has come for the Congress and members of the president's own party to take a stand. Congress simply cannot afford to remain silent in the face of such an unprecedented violation of the separation of powers. Now, I understand that Senator Lee has introduced a bill to reform the National Emergencies Act. I appreciate the thought he's put into this issue. And I'm certainly going to review his legislation with an open mind, but make no mistake. Legislation to fix future abuses of this law, that doesn't address the abuse we have happening right now. His bill does not address the fact that this president is trying to do an end run around Congress, an end run around both Democrats and Republicans alike, and cynically using an emergency declaration to fund a request that we had voted on and did not approve. We must send a message to the president that this is unacceptable. This is not something that nobody's ever voted on. We have voted on this matter. And under the Constitution, that is what is supposed to carry the day. And I hope my Republican friends take a moment to take stock of where we are. President Trump's going to be but a moment in our nation's history. The Constitution to control our history,
whatever it is that stops
no matter who is president.
from driving drunk.
And for the sake of appeasing a man who made a foolish campaign promise that was never grounded in reality, won't they stand up for the institution which they serve? For the sake of appeasing a president who detests any limits or checks on his authority, even those in the Constitution, will they forever diminish the role of Congress as a co-equal branch of government? Now is the time for country over party. And how vote I on the joint resolution of disapproval? I urge all senators to do the same. President, I do not see somebody seeking the floor. I'm about to suggest the absence of quorum. Is this under controlled time?
The time is controlled equally between the proponents and opponents.
I suggest the absence of quorum, but ask unanimous consent that the time consumed by the quorum be equally divided between both sides.
Without objection. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
So I guess my question really is, I'm appreciative of trying to bring technology into play and have it be helpful, but are we educating our local PAs, our state folks, because the drunk driving has been around for a while, but the imposition of multi-physic polypharmacy along with the alcohol really can confound the issue. And I might just ask our two former administrators, acting administrators, is this something on which you focused during your time at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration?
The Senate came in this morning at 10 o'clock Eastern. They will vote early this afternoon on the House resolution that would terminate the president's national emergency declaration on the border, seeking to appropriate funds from the 2019 spending for building a border wall to $6.7 billion. Congress approved $1.4 billion in its 2019 spending approval. The House passed the resolution. It came out of the House a couple of weeks ago, 245 to 182. We've heard a number of senators speak about the resolution. Senator Leahy most recently, Senator Alexander of Tennessee now saying he'll vote in favor of the resolution against the national emergency declaration. He spoke on the floor and then told reporters afterwards that he would be voting yes on that. So far, the count looks like this of Republican senators who have indicated in some way that they will vote in favor.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent to end the quorum call.
Without objection.
The Senate will soon vote on the President's declaration of a national emergency. We have reached a moment of crisis. But it's not a constitutional crisis. It's a crisis on the border, a crisis of American sovereignty. When hundreds of thousands of foreigners arrive at the southern border and demand entry, that's not migration. That's an emergency and a threat to our sovereignty. And the stories speak for themselves. Last Thursday, an American citizen named Rocio Aldurate was shot to death on a bridge over the Mexican border near McAllen, Texas. Early reports suggest that Rocio was caught in a shootout between cartel gunmen and Mexican police. But whatever the case turns out to be, Rocio has perished. The latest American victim of lawlessness at our border. Since last October, the Border Patrol agents have apprehended more than 260,000 illegal aliens at the border, a surge of 90%, almost double from the previous year. For the most part, these aren't young men coming for work, as is so often the case in the past, but rather Central Americans gaming our generous asylum laws. Instead of running away from the Border Patrol, these illegal aliens run to it so they can be captured and released into the country with notice to appear in court, which they hardly ever do. And thanks to stupid laws and activist judges, illegal aliens are even using little kids as legal force fields because being detained with a minor increases their odds of being held in America, not turned around and sent home. As a result, we see all the horrors of the human smuggling trade at the border today. Women and girls are sexually assaulted at horrific rates. Hundreds die in the desert each year of thirst and exhaustion. Infectious diseases we'd all but eradicated with vaccines are appearing again in border communities. ICE health officials have found 236 confirmed or probable cases of mumps among detainees in the past year, after reporting 0 cases for the previous 2 years. This surge of illegal aliens is swamping law enforcement's ability to do its job. Overwhelmed, that's the word we hear so often from agents. And Border Patrol Commissioner Kevin McAleenan says this is clearly both a border security and a humanitarian crisis. The consequences of this crisis stretch far beyond the border, sometimes thousands of miles away. An American, one of 192 every day, dies of a drug overdose. The poison in his veins flowed across the Mexican border. A brave police officer and father, Corporal Ronell Singh of California, is shot dead the day after Christmas. His killer snuck in the country illegally. We have failed to protect our border, as any sovereign nation must, and our people are dying because of it. The president has declared a national emergency because of this crisis. Yet, the administration's sensible, long overdue efforts to secure the border have been met only by howls of outrage from the Democratic Party and its media wing. Judging from their reaction, you'd think the real emergency wasn't our lawless border, but any genuine effort to secure it.
Fascinating.
The minority leader called the president's emergency declaration a lawless act that showed naked contempt for the rule of law. Other members of the self-styled resistance have compared the president to Hitler. Curious overheated claims, I have to say. To be lawless, after all, one must act outside the law. Yet the president's critics don't even bother making that case, probably because they don't have much of one to make. The president isn't purporting to invoke his inherent executive powers under Article 2 of our Constitution. He doesn't even claim to defend his constitutional prerogatives from legislative encroachment. On the contrary, he is only exercising the statutory authority delegated to him by us, by this very body, the United States Congress. More than half of the $8.1 billion the president is using to build the wall and secure the border comes from non-emergency statutes passed by Congress. The remainder comes from an explicit delegation of various powers to the president in the event of a national emergency, just like the one that the president has declared, which we also delegated him the authority to do. I should add that the National Emergencies Act was passed nearly unanimously, with only 5 no votes in the House. Now, I'm sympathetic to arguments that the National Emergencies Act is too broad and gives the executive branch too much power. That's a reasonable debate to have. Believe me, Congress has ceded too much power to the executive for more than a century, expanding an administrative state that increasingly deprives our people of a meaningful say in their government. So I invite my Democratic colleagues to reconsider the wisdom of this path. Maybe we can also reform the EPA. Perhaps we could require up or down votes in Congress to approve big regulations so the politicians around here could show some accountability for once.
Exactly.
I'm ready to have those debates. Believe me, I'm ready. But in the meantime, don't pretend that we didn't delegate all these powers or that it's lawless for the executive to use the laws that we pass just because you deplore him. If you want to see lawless executive action, by the way, you can look instead to the last administration. President Obama purported to give millions of illegal aliens legal status, and work permits in clear violations of statutes passed by this Congress. And he expressly defied our ban on bailout payments from the Obamacare slush fund to big health insurance companies. Strange how I don't recall the self-styled resistance manning the ramparts and rushing to the Ninth Circuit back then. In fact, I only recall a lot of congressional fanboys of a president using the pen and phone to encroach on our constitutional prerogatives. Now, I've also heard from some senators who admit that the president is acting lawfully, but who worry about the slippery slope of executive power. I respect this view. Our system of separated powers calls on each branch to jealously protect its own powers. But one can ski to the bottom of the slippery slope pretty fast. Today, a Republican declares a national emergency on the border. Tomorrow, a Democrat, or who knows these days, maybe a socialist, declares a gun violence emergency to confiscate guns, or a climate change emergency to shut down coal-fired power plants. Now, I'll acknowledge it doesn't take much to imagine such abuses by a future liberal president, especially with the gang they've got running today. But that's precisely what such actions would be, abuses. What the law says matters here. We have delegated to the executive the power to enforce the nation's immigration laws, including by emergency declaration. We have not delegated to the executive the power to confiscate guns, close power plants, or any of the other common entrants in the parade of horribles on the slippery slope. That's the difference between lawful and lawless government. And that's the case here. Now, still others claim that the crisis on the border isn't bad enough to call a national emergency. Some have gone so far as to deride it as a fake emergency. Well, if killings and caravans and cartels out at the border are a fake emergency, I'd really hate to see a genuine emergency. But let's suppose we take their claim seriously. We at least ought to be able to compare the crisis at the border to past national emergencies to see how they all stack up. Right now, there are 32 national emergencies in effect. 32 national emergencies. Among them is a national emergency related to election fraud in Belarus. Another is in response to the breakdown of the rule of law in Lebanon. A third is in response to a failed coup in Burundi. I don't deny those are all genuine problems or that an American response may well be warranted. Far from it. But I doubt many Americans would put them ahead of a serial violation of our sovereign border by millions of foreigners. If the Belarusians warrant an emergency declaration, then surely Americans do too when we face a crisis at our southern border. Democrats used to take border security seriously. But in elite society these days, border security is a bad word. And wall is practically a four-letter word. Unless it's the walls that protect the rich and the powerful and the politically connected from a dangerous world. Yet look in the news. The Democrats' newest presidential aspirant, Robert Francis O'Rourke, a former congressman and failed Senate candidate, has gone so far to suggest tearing down existing barriers at the southern border, which I'm sure thrilled all the good people in El Paso who don't live in a world of private planes and security details. Regrettably, the Democrats' hostility to border security couldn't come at a worse time for our country, because there is indeed a crisis at the border, and we ought to be addressing it. We could be spending this valuable legislative time to tighten up our asylum laws or crack down on employers who exploit illegal aliens instead of hiring American workers, or ramp up drug enforcement. Instead, we're debating whether a crisis at our southern border can be called an emergency. Instead of solving a problem, we're trying to spin it. So I have a simple suggestion for my colleagues. If you're genuinely alarmed by the president's invocation of the very emergency powers we delegated to him, Instead of furrowing your brows and tugging your chins and bravely signing the Youngstown sheet, let's tackle this emergency declaration by making it unnecessary. Let's get to the root of the problem and secure our border once and for all. No more border crisis, no more emergency. It's as simple as that.
Or they'll have a kid touch it, believe it or not. So these types
of things, I yield the floor.
My understanding also, if I make ways, if we can't get around these things, we decide to do it as we should. Mr. Kelly, what are the particular challenges drug-impaired driving pose that alcohol-impaired driving does not?
Mr. President, note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
To define what is inherent from
Mr. Alexander.
and each drug is going to have it different, whether it's marijuana, whether it's prescription drug, whatever it is, they each are differently. And setting a legal limit is probably number one challenge to trying to define, because as we talk about this in this setting, when it gets down to an enforcement perspective and a prosecution perspective, judges and juries, they like per se levels, and that's the biggest challenge of getting these types of cases prosecuted.
And for example,
Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas saying they're in favor, speaking against the resolution, quote, it's not a constitutional crisis, it's a crisis on the border. So far, it appears that there are some 7 Republican senators who would vote in favor of the resolution. Susan Collins, Tom Tillis, Lisa Murkowski, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Mitt Romney, and Lamar Alexander, the latest, although there is some speculation as to whether Tom Tillis will follow through and vote. That vote expected early this afternoon. Again, the Senate's likely to approve the resolution terminating the president's national emergency. The president expressing again this morning in the Oval Office with meetings with the Irish Prime Minister that he would veto that measure. Let's hear what the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had to say to open the session this morning as this quorum call continues.
The Senate will vote on a resolution related to the state of emergency the President has declared on our southern border. Let me first say that I support the President's decision, so I'll vote today to uphold it and reject this resolution of disapproval. But I want to begin where this whole discussion should begin. Beyond all the partisan rhetoric and denials of reality that we see from our friends across the aisle, just the facts of the matter. And the facts are not at all ambiguous. There's a clear border security and humanitarian crisis on the southern border of the United States of America. It was only last week that the President's top officials in the matter, Secretary Nielsen, CBP Commissioner McElwain, each came before Congress to once again lay all this out. The men charged with protecting our nation's borders didn't mince words ahead of last week's hearing. This is what he had to say. The system is well beyond capacity and remains at the breaking point. The system is well beyond capacity and remains at the breaking point. The Commissioner pointed out to our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee that the 76,000 attempted illegal crossings documented in February marked an 11-year high for that month, and based on CPB projections, by the middle of this month, that is tomorrow, apprehensions for fiscal 2009 will already be twice what they were in all of fiscal year 2017. And in front of the House Homeland Security Committee, the Secretary of Homeland Security elaborated by saying the following: our capacity is already severely strained, but these increases will overwhelm the system completely. Now, this is one of the President's senior advisors, a cabinet secretary, and she's telling members of Congress that the current situation is very much a crisis, one that requires immediate action. Over the past 5 years, CPB has recorded a 620% increase in apprehensions of family units at the U.S.-Mexico border. Last year's figure marked an all-time high. Research suggests upwards of 30% of women apprehended at the border report experiencing sexual assault during the journeys. Lately, a daily average of 56 individuals taking into CPB custody have required emergency medical care. So, Madam President, the men and women of the Border Patrol are brave. They are well trained. They are highly skilled. And they volunteered for a very challenging job. But today they are facing challenges that they're not fully equipped to overcome. It's no secret I take the Senate as an institution extremely seriously. I take the separation of powers extremely seriously. And I take Congress' prerogative over appropriations extremely seriously. But as I argued yesterday in the context of the Yemen resolution, the Senate should not be in the business of misusing specific resolutions to express opinions on more general.
As consent, the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last month I launched a new series of floor speeches to recognize what is going on with the prescription drug pricing across America. When you ask the American people about the economic things that are on their mind, it's number one, the cost of prescription drugs. Number two, have I saved enough money for my retirement? It really gets to the heart of concerns that families have every day, because each one of us knows that the cost of prescription drugs are going up. We also realize how vulnerable we may be as individuals if one of those drugs is a matter of life and death. I came to the floor last 2 weeks ago to talk about the cost of insulin. 7.5 million diabetics across America have seen dramatic increases in the cost of insulin, increases which can't be justified because the same companies, American companies, selling the same drugs in Canada do it for a fraction of the cost. A fraction of the cost. The Americans pay outrageous prices. A drug like Humalog, a form of insulin, one of the most popular forms of insulin, costs $329 a dosage in the United States. 20 years ago, it was about $29. It's gone up in price 35 times in that 20-year period of time. How much does the exact same drug that costs $329 in the United States cost in Canada, made by the same company? $38. So you look at that and you think, there's something wrong here. The pharmaceutical industry is not focusing on giving American consumers a break. And what I want to talk about today goes to an issue which is hard to believe, but true. A few years ago, the New York Times reported that nearly $3 billion worth of drugs were wasted each year. These are not ordinary drugs, these are cancer drugs used in chemotherapy. Medicare, Medicaid, and private health insurers spend billions of dollars on medications. Many of them are literally thrown in the trash. How could that possibly be? You see, for many of the most expensive drugs, like new cancer treatments, the pharmaceutical industry produces them in a one-size-fits-all container, a single-use vial that a physician has to draw from to give a treatment to a patient. The dosage for the patient in the cancer therapy is based on the patient's size and weight. The problem is that the pharmaceutical industry insists on selling these drugs in excessively large vials that contain dramatically more medicine than the average patient would need. So doctors administer the proper dosage and throw away the rest. Here's a kind of graphic to illustrate what I'm talking about here. Here's why we're wasting billions of dollars each year on cancer drugs. One size does not fit all. This drug, Velcade, vial size and available is 3.5 milligrams. The patient dose, 2.2. Amount that's left over, 1.3. Oh, it's going to recycle that? Can't do it. That's the end of it. It's thrown away. In 2016, $300 million was wasted in this way. This vial, the first one here that is produced, is a vial that would apply for a person who is 6'6" tall and weighing 250 pounds. Which means our linebacker, Khalil Mack, on the Chicago Bears, God forbid he ever would need it, that would be his dosage size. Most people are not as big as Chicago Bears linebackers. Why is pharma sending us one vial, take it or leave it? Because they make money. They make money when we buy it and have to throw it away. Takeda Pharmaceuticals sells this drug for those who are suffering from multiple myeloma and lymphoma. As I mentioned, it's for a person who's 6'6" and 250 pounds. Takeda made $310 million in the year 2016 off of unused Velcade that got thrown in the trash. $310 million. What makes this even more appalling is the pharmaceutical industry titans actually sell the same drug in smaller containers in other countries, but not in the United States. Here, we're forced to buy the largest container and throw away the difference.
I know you're not representing that, but what are they looking for?
This chart here is an indication.
What is MAD looking for
in the way of
the same company, Takeda, that makes Velcade, sells this drug not in 3.5 milligram vials, as in the United States, but in Europe in 1 milligram vials. It seems like a simple thing, doesn't it? That you would dispense this drug in a manner so that it's not wasted. Sadly, wasting and throwing away the drug is part of their market strategy. Another Japanese company, Eisai Halaven, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name, sells its chemotherapy drug, Halaven, only in 1 milligram vials in the United States, but sells smaller 0.88 milligram vials in Europe. Merck's immunotherapy drug Keytruda, truly a breakthrough, amazing drug. Research was done by taxpayers at the National Institutes of Health, which led to the development of this drug. But they sell this drug Keytruda only in 100 milligram vials in the United States, but 50 milligram vials in Europe. In 2016, Merck made $200 million on Keytruda, this life-saving drug that was thrown away. In 2016, I asked the Inspector General of Health and Human Services about this waste of taxpayers' money. They uncovered, the Inspector General uncovered, that Medicare spent $195 million in just 1 year on 20 identified drugs for medication that was thrown away. That year, Takeda received $47 million in taxpayer funding for amounts of Velcade thrown in the trash. It wasn't alone. Genentech's Rituxan, one of the most common cancer medications, only comes in vials that are 100 milligrams or 500 milligrams. Medicare wasted $10 million on Rituxan in 2013 that was thrown away. It's for this reason that I'm presenting my second Pharma Fleecing Award to Takeda, Eisai, Merck, and Genentech. Patients in America should not face higher drug costs because these pharma fleecers choose to sell their expensive cancer drugs in excessively large drug vials that necessarily are going to be wasted. 2 weeks ago, I teamed up with Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio to introduce the Refund Act, a simple bill that Senator Portman and I have introduced, and I hope others will join us. It says that taxpayers will only pay for the drug that is given to a patient, not for the part that's thrown away. Medicare already tracks how much of this medication is being discarded. So the Refund Act simply requires Medicare to determine how much was wasted and to recoup the money from the drug companies. We then provide a portion of that money back to seniors for the 20% co-insurance they have to pay for the drugs. Important point. When Medicare is paying for these drugs and a lot are being thrown away, the seniors are still paying their 20%, even for the drug portion that's being thrown away. So Rob Portman's bill, the one I've introduced with him, would say that the money recouped from the drug companies will go back to the benefit of these seniors. Under our new bill, this form of fleecing from drug vial waste will soon come to an end, so that not just the patients, but our government will save money. And remember the bottom line. When you ask the major health insurers today, what is driving the cost of health insurance premiums, they say, Senator, prescription drug pricing is number one. Blue Cross Blue Shield, based out of Chicago, when I sit down with them, say we spend more money on prescription drugs than we do on inpatient hospital care. To give you an idea, it's out of sight. You can't turn on a television set, particularly if you're over the age of 50, without being bombarded with all these drug ads, right? You've heard them over and over again. The number one drug that's being sold on television today? Humira. What is it for? Psoriatic arthritis. Serious. If you have the arthritis, that may be a lifesaver for you. But it's now being sold for that little red patch on your elbow called psoriasis.
As a priority.
You know how much Humira costs each month? $5,000.
But it needs to be an
$5,000.
absolute priority.
I have legislation that would require these drug companies to advertise the cost of their drugs on television. They tell us everything else, don't they? They tell us if you're allergic to Humira, don't take Humira. I've never understood that warning. And they tell us everything under the sun, but they never mention the price. So what I want to do is to get the price out in front of the public. Let them know what being perfect in a swimsuit is going to cost you per month. You know, from my point of view, there are people who need these drugs desperately, and we ought to try to get the prices within their reach. But for those who are overusing and abusing the airwaves of America to advertise drugs, to try to push doctors into writing the scripts, even when it's not necessary, we've got to come to grips with this. If we don't, we are not going to have a serious effort to reduce the cost of health insurance and the health care costs that face our nation. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
But we still to this day hear about that campaign to require seat belts being buckled, and it's used as an excuse for everything. And we got to stop using it. It is now 2019. It's not the 1970s, and people are dying, and the technology exists. So I'm looking at that little girl who said to me, "It exists. Why aren't we using it?" So I thank all of you for being here. Mr. Strasburger, you answered some questions about how many are being currently tested, but what I want to
Senator Richard Durbin on the floor talking about prescription drug prices. The main focus of the Senate agenda today is voting on the House resolution which would terminate the president's national emergency for the border and prevent him from appropriating spending from military construction and other areas. So far, on public record, some 7 Republican senators would vote along with Democrats to support that. It passed in the House with 13 Republicans, 245 to 182. The president saying he'd veto it, and by those measures, that margin, it appears that certainly the House, the Senate wouldn't have the ability to overturn the president's veto. Senators in and out of the chamber, lots going on Capitol Hill with hearings and the traditional Friends of Ireland luncheon. The Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, is in Washington visiting with the president and up on Capitol Hill shortly for that luncheon. So there may be pauses throughout the day until the vote gets underway. As this quorum call continues, we'll show you the opening comments this morning from the Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer.
Madam President, tomorrow the Senate will vote on a resolution to terminate the President's emergency declaration, a declaration which undermines our separation of powers in order to fund the President's wall with American taxpayer dollars, despite candidate Trump's repeated promises that Mexico would pay for it. The resolution could not be any simpler. All it says is this, it's one single sentence, quote, resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that pursuant to Section 202 of the National Emergencies Act, the national emergency declared by the finding of the President on February 15, 2019 in Proclamation 9844 is hereby terminated. That's the entirety. There's no political games here. There's no gotcha. There's no discussion as to whether we need a wall or not, whether there's a crisis on the southern border or not. It simply says that this is not an emergency. Now, the vote tomorrow boils down to something very simple for our Republican friends. Do you believe in the Constitution and conservative principles? All these self-proclaimed conservatives. Well, the number one tenet of conservatism is no one, particularly an executive or president, should have too much power. That's been what conservatives have stood for through the centuries. And all of a sudden, because Donald Trump says
this Congress could
that he wants to declare an emergency, are people going to succumb? The founding fathers would be rolling in their graves. They'd be rolling in their graves for any president, let alone this one, who we know overreaches in terms of power, who we know has no understanding of the exquisite and delicate balance that James Madison and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so many others created in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So, do our Republican friends stand for conservative principles? Do they stand for any principles at all? Or do they just take a loyalty pledge to President Trump and meekly do whatever he wants? It's that simple. Now, there are lots of issues we disagree on. There are lots of times our Republican friends bow to President Trump. But there ought to be an exception. And if there ever was an exception, it should be this. Many of my Republican colleagues rightly stood up and told the president not to take this action. Leader McConnell himself said it was a bad idea. A bad precedent, contravenes the power of the purse, a dangerous step, an erosion of congressional authority. And they, Republican friends, were right. The president himself said, quote, he didn't need to do this. That's not an emergency.
Let me just say that.
Are we going to say any time that the president can't get his way or her way with Congress, that they can declare an emergency and Congress will meekly shrug its shoulders and walk by, bow in obeisance to any president, Democrat or Republican?
In the meantime,
what a disgrace. This is one of the true tests of our Republican colleagues. One of the true tests. Because it's always been the Democratic Party that's been for a stronger executive.
Witnesses, I want to thank all the members.
You know, Dwight Eisenhower, he was worried about too much power going to the president. So was Ronald Reagan. Where are our Republican friends now? Has Donald Trump turned this Republican Party and its conservative principles so inside out that you can't even get 4 votes?
I asked each witness to
declare this an emergency, to declare this isn't an emergency.
For information that you may receive. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.
From yesterday, the Democratic leader Chuck Schumer talking about today's vote expected early this afternoon on terminating the president's national emergency. The emergency declared just about a month ago on February the 15th. Following that the House created and passed that resolution by a vote of 245 to 182. And here today in the Senate, they'll take it up under the National Emergencies Act, passed in the 70s. It allows Congress to overturn a presidential emergency. And so far, both today and as of yesterday and as of this morning, it appears that some 7 Republican senators would vote in favor of that resolution. An exact time of the vote is not known, but we will have it all for you here, obviously, on C-SPAN 2. Just a note from the Senate as well, some sad news from former Senator Birch Bayh. He has passed away, died at the age of 91. Senator Bayh, the lead sponsor of Title IX in 1972, the landmark law banning discrimination against women in college admissions and sports. Current Indiana Senator Todd Young saying that Birch Bayh is a modern-day founding father. He used his tenure in the Senate to push for substantive and substantial change, including 2 constitutional amendments and the passage of Title IX. Birch Bayh dead at the age of 91. It's a quorum call. Members will come to the floor shortly speaking more about this and other issues, and again, a vote early this afternoon on the resolution. Let's hear what Tennessee Senator, Republican Lamar Alexander, had to say earlier this morning.
Madam President, Tennesseans ask me, is there really a crisis on the southern border? Do you support President Trump's border wall? And my answer to both questions is, yes, I do. I've urged the president to build the 234 miles of border wall that he asked for in his January the 6th letter to the Senate, and to do that in the fastest possible way with a minimum delay and legal challenge by using the $5.7 billion already approved by Congress. But the president's emergency declaration to take an additional $3.6 billion that Congress has appropriated for military hospitals